Corinthians chapter 11. We'll pick it up there in just a moment. First, we're going to look over our outline of the book, and then we're going to come into chapter 11 itself, review what we already saw. It's been a week and a half now, and then finish up the discussion on the headship and the covering, and then try to get through the latter half of chapter 11. This evening, quick sign up for chapter 12. I got ready to print them off this afternoon. Hit print, and told me I wouldn't communicate with the printer. So I'll try to get chapter 12 out to you by Sunday, but the printer was not working this evening to print that, and so we didn't have those outlines out on the back table just yet. But I'll try to get them out Sunday so you have them when we get to chapter 12, provided we get through chapter 11 this evening. The book of 1 Corinthians itself is about contentions among you. That's what we said the theme is. As Paul's writing to a church that is filled with a great many problems. And so we divide it down really by how it is you learn about some of these problems or the problems that are dealt with. And so the first section is problems you learn about report. It is reported about the divisions by the household of Chloe in chapters 1 through 4. In chapter 5, it is actually reported there is sexual immorality among you. And so chapters 5 and 6 deal with that issue of fornication. Chapter 5 also deals with their lack of discipline. And then chapter 6 deals with the problem of litigation. They're going to law against one another. It's then in chapter 7 we have a transition. And once we begin to deal with questions they ask Paul. So they ask questions about marriage in chapter 7. We know it's a transition because he says in verse 1 of chapter 7, now concerning the things about which you wrote to me. And so he talks to them about the marriage relationship in chapter 7. Chapters 8, 9, and 10 is about meat that has been sacrificed to idols. And so that's what he's dealing with in those three chapters that we covered a few weeks back. Chapter 11 has two different issues in it. There is a question about the covering and headship, which is the section we're still in. And then about the abuse of the Lord's Supper in the latter half. And then chapters 12 through 14 is another unit of chapters dealing with spiritual gifts. The last two chapters each fit in their own section. So the third section is just chapter 15, and that's Paul's teaching on the resurrection. And then the final section is chapter 16, and that is collection and salutation. We're ready for chapter 13. We began this a week and a half ago, studying 1 Corinthians, or chapter 11 rather, 1 Corinthians 11, dealing with the headship and the Lord's Supper. And so we began by pointing out last time that we've got to deal with some questions concerning the head covering as we come into chapter 11. This is the passage that's talked about when it comes to use of the head covering. And so there's a question about, is the covering hair or is it an artificial covering? Is it that a woman needs to have long hair and that's the covering she needs? Or is there an artificial covering she's to wear on her head? Well, as we go through the chapter, there's a term rendered veil, which Bedak says means covered or veiled to the forehead. And so that gives us the idea of being covered or veiled to the forehead, the idea of it being an artificial veil. It is compared to the hair. It is not the same as the hair. And so as you look through the chapter, and we'll get to this here in a moment, it's about where we left off last time. He talks about nature and the hair, and he compares the wearing of a covering to the hair. He doesn't use them as one and the same. He then talks about a custom or a practice, which I believe is the custom is the keeping of the covering. We'll get to that in a moment. Versus nature. So whatever's under discussion for most of the chapter, he says the churches have no custom on verse 16, but the length of hair in 14 and 15 is referred to as nature. And so I believe the covering of this text must be an artificial covering. And with that, all that in mind about the cover or veil to the forehead, and it being compared to the hair but not being the same, and being a custom or practice versus nature. Well, then even after we said all that, there's still several views, and one of those will involve the hair. But there are four main views about the covering. Really, we could. There's probably more, but these are the four that if you're talking to somebody about the covering, these are the four you're most going to hear. The first of those is that it is an artificial covering, and it was binding then in 1 Corinthians, and it's binding now. And so they look at it and they say, I think 1 Corinthians 11 is dealing with something that needs to still be observed. It's a covering that is to be worn for all time. Right? For then and for now, it's still binding today. Even among that group, though, there are two different views. There's the view that it applies at all times. Anytime there's prayer being offered, there's a study, that the covering is to be worn, or that it applies only in church. That it applies only in the assembly. So again, there are four main views, but we've got subcategories within those. The second main view is that it was binding now, but it's not artificial, it's the hair. And so that the covering is the hair, and it's still binding today, that it needs to be, women need to have long hair. There are those that say it's not binding today because it applies to spiritual gifts. In the text, it said in verse 4, every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonors his head, but every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head. So he doesn't need to have this covered. She does, they dishonor. And he talks about prayer and prophecy. And so the argument is, well, prayer and prophecy are mentioned here. And so what he's talking about is that it applies only then, but it only applied then because it has to do with spiritual gifts. It didn't have to do with being a custom. The fourth position is it's not binding then because it was a matter of custom. That's the position I hold, and the position we've discussed. We were talking about the last time about it being a custom of the day. Now, a couple of other things we want to remind ourselves of, that this issue was not made a test of fellowship by those who believe in it. There are some who say, well, the covering is not binding, but we won't have brother so-and-so who believes it is because they made it a test of fellowship. Except it wasn't made a test of fellowship by those who believed it was binding. I said before, I preached at a congregation before who everybody there thinks it's binding. And they've had my dad there, they've had Donnie there, who hold to the same position I do. They've had many people through there for meetings or to fill in from time to time that hold to the same position, that it's not binding. It wasn't made a test of fellowship. It's more often been made a test of fellowship by those who do not believe in it than those who believe in it. I made the point, I said I don't think it's binding, but if somebody feels they need to wear it, I will not seek to remove it. I defend the right of one to wear it. If they feel they need to wear it, I would argue they need to wear it. And I would argue that on the basis of chapters 8 through 10 of the same text, as well as Romans 14, that violating one's conscience is sin. And if they feel guilty not wearing it, then it would be wrong for them not to wear it. We mentioned the last time there is the Hutto and Needham exchange if you want to read more about this. Brother Hiram Hutto wrote arguing for the covering being binding, while Brother James Needham argued against it being binding. And so, if somebody wants to read more detail on both sides of why some say it's binding and some say it's not, that gives you a look at both sides. It gives you a thorough discussion. It was an article written back and forth. In fact, you can go on to the slides. They're already on the site from the last time, or I'll have them posted for this class later on. And if you click that, start the slideshow and click that link, it'll take you to searchingthescriptures.com, where there is a link to the archive of these articles written by Hutto and Needham about this issue. And so if you want to see that in more detail, they can give you more detail as they're arguing from both sides. And so you can see both sides of the argument in more detail than we can cover in just Bible class. Another thing to mention is, as I already said, if you're convinced you must wear it, then I'll defend the right of one that believes they must wear it to wear it. Again, based on 1 Corinthians 8, 9, and 10, and Romans 14. Some things to understand, though, that we talked about the last time as to why I think it's a custom, evidence to give. As I said, any one of these, with the exception of number 6, I think number 6 is the strongest argument. Any one of these on their own, I don't think is overwhelming evidence, but I think the series of these together gives the evidence as to why it is a custom. In verse 2, let's go ahead and go to the text, and then we'll review through this again, but just sort of getting an overview of it. Verse 2, he commended them for keeping traditions, and I believe that's the apostolic traditions. He said, now I commend you because you remember me in everything and maintain the traditions, even even as I delivered them to you. Now, that word traditions has to do with a long-standing practice. Sometimes that word is used to refer to that which was taught by the apostles. Sometimes that word traditions is used to refer to an actual tradition by man. But the idea of that word rendered tradition just has to do with it's a long-standing practice. And so the context determines which use of the word traditions it is. And I actually think, based on verse 2, the evidence is it's the apostolic tradition. And here's where I think it would point to that. The problem is, no matter what side anybody takes on the view of the head covering, there's agreement on this. There's a problem of they weren't wearing it. Or at least were taking it off in certain situations. That they weren't wearing it as they were supposed to. It would seem strange that he would commend them for keeping traditions, the apostolic traditions, if they then were violating a command to wear the covering. So he says, I commend you for keeping the traditions. Then he comes and says, there's a problem with them not wearing the covering, and here's what that means. But then he comes at the end, and we'll get to this in a minute, and calls it a custom of practice. So what he's saying is, the issue as to what this covering is that the people in that society viewed it as a sign of what? The wife being submissive. Right? It was a sign of her husband being over her. Their problem wasn't with them keeping the God's law about headship. They understood that. The problem was they were keeping the custom of her wearing that sign. And so he commends them for keeping traditions and then turns around and tells them they weren't wearing the covering. I think that the point to the fact that it was not the apostolic tradition, rather it was the custom of the day. Verses 4 through 7, he calls it a sign or a symbol of subjection. It was at that time. But it is not viewed as such now. It's not in our society. Are there other societies where that's true? That they view that covering, the woman should wear a covering, yes, but it's not true in our society today. In verse 13, the King James Version uses the word comely. The New King James uses the word proper. And that word can refer to that which corresponds with accepted decorum of the day. Now, it has been used at times of God's law, but again, it's the accepted decorum of the day. Here's what you need to do in the wearing of the covering. Number 4, the covering is not mentioned in any other passage on headship. Now, to be binding doesn't have to be, right? Something can be said one time and be binding, but the fact that there are several passages that deal with here's the need to be submissive, and no other passage ever mentions they need to be submissive by wearing the covering, that they need to wear the covering as a sign of subjection, that shows that it's a custom here in Corinth that they kept to wear the covering. In fact, it can be established that it was a custom at that day and time for women to wear covering as a sign of subjection in that area in and around Corinth. And then again, verse 16, I think before the strongest piece of evidence, he calls it a custom and says the church has no such custom or practice, depending on your translation. Now, one other thing we pointed out last time, and we'll hit before we get back into the text, is that a customs change, but principles do not change. What do we mean by that? Customs change, but principles do not. Well, there may be a way in which whatever this principle is was shown in that day and time, that it may not be shown the same way today, but it was a custom. John 13, Jesus washed the disciples' feet. That was the principle has to do with hospitality and service. How was that shown in that day and time? Well, it was shown by foot washing. Well, that's not shown the same way today. But you may show it more when you have somebody in your home. You may show it by taking their coat for them, right, and hanging it up. There are different ways to do it today. The foot washing is not what's binding. The principle behind that is what's binding. Romans 16:16. He talks about greet one another with a holy kiss. The idea, the principle is be cordial to all, that should say. Or that's the principle. Do we greet in our society with a holy kiss? No. How do we greet one another here? With a handshake. But can you go to other societies in the way that's shown? Their custom there, can you greet one another with a kiss on the cheek? Yes. That's the custom there. The custom may be different, but the principle is the same. Coming to 1 Corinthians 11 now. The custom was that the woman showed subjection by wearing the covering. That may have changed, but the principle is she's to be submissive and her husband is head over her. The principle remains, though that custom may change. We'll come back to that idea of custom in a minute. Let's quickly review through the early part of the text and what we saw. There are two parts of the text, and we're down in verse 10 is where we left off. But we'll quickly hit this again here. 2 through 16 on headship and the covering. Again, beginning verse 2 is verse 1. We finished up with chapter 10 because we went with chapter 10. 2 and 3 is the order of headship. So he says in verse 2, Now I commend you because you remember me in everything and maintain the traditions, even as I delivered them to you. But I want you to understand the head of every man is Christ, the head of a wife is her husband. That should be woman. If you have an ESV, note that is woman instead of, or that his wife is her husband, and the head of Christ is God. Every man who prays or prophesies with his head uncovered dishonors his head, but every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head. And so he talks about, here's the order of headship in these verses. And again, if you have an English Standard Version, which is what I preach from, what I have open here, you'll see the word wife and husband, mostly wife, and then it'll say man, but in verse 3 it says wife and husband. But if you have a New King James, it'll say head of man is Christ, head of woman is man. They mistranslate that in the ESV. So every time you see wife, if you're reading from an English Standard Version, just remind yourself that is the word woman. That's what it says. And so what he points out in 2 and 3 is, well, you maintain the tradition, but remember this, that the head of man is Christ, the head of woman is man, and the head of Christ is God. There's an order of headship. 4 through 6 then is that head covering as a symbol of the submission, right? The husband is the head, the wife is to be subjected to him. And so every man who prays or prophesies with his head uncovered dishonors his head, and every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head, since it is the same as if her head were shaven. For if a wife will not cover her head, then she should cut her hair short. But since it is disgraceful for a wife to cut off her hair or shave her head, let her cover her head. So if a woman, he says the man shouldn't cover his head, right? When he prays or prophesies, but the woman should. And if she doesn't, it would be, then she should just cut her hair short. Verse 6. For a man, verse 7, ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and glory of God, but the woman is the glory of man. For man was not made for woman, but woman for man. Neither was man created for woman, but woman for man. And so he talks here about some of the things that symbolize, and we see in other passages, right? Why is the man the head? Man was made, not made for woman, but woman was made for man. And so he talks about that here. Paul will point out later in 1 Timothy, right, the order of headship is man was created first, and then it was woman. And so he's really arguing in this early part here that the man is the head of his wife. He argues that through verse 12. In fact, he says that is why a woman, verse 10, ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. Nevertheless, in the Lord, a woman is not dependent of man or man of woman. For a woman was made for man, so man was born of woman, now born of woman, and all things are from God. And so he argues again here throughout this on the headship. Man's head of wife, but nevertheless, the woman is not independent of man or man of woman. Woman was made from man, and now man is born of woman. Right? And so he said all things ultimately are from God. Coming back to verse 10, we ended on this the last time. I want to remind ourselves of it. Verse 10 is a very difficult passage. And no matter what side anybody takes, which of those four main views somebody takes in verse 10, there's no agreement on what verse 10 means. Ultimate agreement. That is why a woman ought to have a symbol of authority on her head, because of the angels. Well, the harder part's the second part. I'll do the first part first. That word symbol, if you have a New King James, you'll notice it is in italics. What does it mean when a word appears in italics? It was added by translators. So take that out. It reads, that is why a woman ought to have authority authority on her head and wear the covering, or that the woman has her husband over her who has authority over her. That's part of the debate, right? And so the argument is sometimes used about the need for the symbol of authority by those who argue for it, that she needs to have that symbol to show that she is in subjection to him. I think the point is, again, that word is not there in the original. The point is that she has one who has authority over her. But the hard part really becomes the latter half of verse 10, and that is, she needs to have a symbol of authority. Why? Because of the angels. What does it mean because of the angels? Well, we'll read commentary after commentary, scholar after scholar, and when you finish, none of them are going to fully convince you of any one position either. They can't, there's not agreement on exactly what that means. What does it mean because of angels? But I'll tell you what I think he means in this. And again, there's a sort of debate, but I think this is what fits best in the context. You remember in the Scriptures, there are angels who did not respect the authority of God. There were those who did not respect his authority. Those are the ones that are bound waiting final judgment. And it's brought up in Jude. I think that's what's under consideration. There were angels who did not have this proper respect for God, who has authority over them. So there's a reminder, right, that remember that the woman has somebody who is head over her, who has authority over her. There needs to be a reminder of that because there were angels who didn't even submit to the authority of God. Now you may read some other argument, be fully convinced of some other position. That's fine. That's what I think, though, probably fits the immediate context the best, is that it has to do with those who did not respect the authority of God. Coming into verse 13 now. Judge for yourselves, is it proper for a wife or for a woman to pray to God with your head uncovered? Does not nature itself teach you that if a man wears long hair, it is a disgrace for him? But if a woman has long hair, it is her glory, for her hair is given to her for a covering. So, 13, 14, and 15, this is why I believe the covering, another reason I believe the covering is artificial. He then contrasts the use of a covering with that of nature. What does nature teach? Women naturally, what? Women naturally have the covering, right, the longer hair than man. In fact, you can look at studies, and more often than not, men may go naturally bald, but that typically doesn't happen with women, right? There's some other, a lot of times with women, there's normally some other case if they were to go completely bald. They have something that they have caused that or some treatment. Women's hair tends to grow faster than men's hair, and so on and so forth. Nature would teach us that naturally women have the longer hair. And what he's saying is women have that natural hair to cover them. I don't think that's the covering he's talking about. Okay? But he's pointing out that women actually have their head covered. And now here you are in a society that says you need to wear a covering over your head. And what he's saying is what you should do is put that covering on. To those people there, if you take that covering off, it's the same as if the woman had what? Shorn. She shaved her head, right? And so they need to wear that covering. And so 13, 14, and 15 is what nature teaches us, but he's bringing up that nature to remind them, you live in here, they view you not wearing the covering in the same way that you viewed as if your woman had shaved her head. And so they should wear the covering. Verse 16 then. If anyone is inclined to be contentious, we have no such practice, nor do the churches done. So again, I think the strongest evidence that this is a custom or practice is the fact that when he calls it a custom or practice in verse 16. But now, again, I've given that evidence the last two times over why I believe the position that it's a custom of the day. But I do want to come back to that idea of a custom here and think about this for a moment. And that is not about this particular custom, but here we are in a society where there's a custom that was shown to them wearing the covering. That may not be true today, but there are other customs that somebody may view as a way that is that if you're in that area, the thing to do would be to observe the custom. Here's an illustration of these verses. Suppose you were living in another country or in some village, and the custom there was the wife showed that she was in subjection to her husband. She always walked 3 steps behind him. He was always in front, and she was always 3 steps behind him. And that society viewed that as that's her way of showing he is the head and I am in subjection to him. What would be the thing to do if you were visiting that village? Yeah, the man should be in front and the woman should walk 3 steps behind him. Would them not keeping this custom here, or us not keeping it if we were going to that village, and I don't know if there's a village that has that custom, but as an illustration, that we went to a village that had that custom, and we're trying to teach them, would us not respecting their customs hinder the gospel? Yes, it could. Right? Could the women here, they're saying, listen, we need to obey God, and they're giving all these things, and as they're teaching them, the women in that society, because remember, in this day and time, we live in a society now where people don't want to look at the roles that God gave, the man being the head and the woman being in subjection. But at this day and time, that was pretty much universally accepted. Right? That the man was the head, and if you go in that society, the woman, and I believe it wasn't that she wasn't putting it on, when she was prophesying, she was taking it off, showing that she viewed herself as equal with him, that there are those that are there who view that as a sign of disrespect to her husband. Would that hinder the ability of those to teach? Absolutely it would. And so not observing the custom can hinder the ability of one to teach. So we may not have that custom today, but if you went somewhere where the custom was the woman wore a head covering to show a sign of subjection, what would be the thing to do? Where the covering, if it was a society where they walked 3 steps behind, what would be the thing to do? Walk the 3 steps behind. And so by doing so, it helps them in teaching those that are present, as well as it doesn't, even if it doesn't turn them off from the gospel because they view that as a sign of disrespect. And so I know that there's a lot of information in there in 1 Corinthians 11. And again, if you want to read more on both sides of that argument, why some say it's binding, some say it's not, that link is on the PowerPoint for you can get it off of our website and then click that link to go to the article from Brother Hutto and Brother Needham, writing each an article arguing for Brother Hutto for it binding and Brother Needham for it not being binding. And then an introduction before that by Brother Wood. And so you can read more information on that. Well, let's get into the latter half now. We've got about 5 minutes or so remaining. The latter half is a lot simpler section. And it is a lot more familiar section. In fact, most of the time, when a passage is read before the Lord's Supper, I wouldn't say most of the time, but I would say the passage is probably most read before the Lord's Supper. It's probably 1 Corinthians chapter 11, some portion of 17 through the end of the chapter. Most often from 23 to about 29. But somewhere in this section. Here's the problem. Verses 17 through 22. As we talk about the Lord's Supper, here's the problem. They're abusing. Let's read 17 through 22. But in the following instructions I do not commend you, because when you come together, it is not for the better, but for the worse. For in the first place, when you come together as a church, I hear that there are divisions among you, and I believe it in part. For there must be factions among you, in order that those who are genuine among you may be recognized. When you come together, it is not the Lord's Supper that you eat, for in eating each one goes ahead with his own meal, one goes hungry, another gets drunk. What? Do you not have houses to eat and drink in, or do you despise the church of God and humiliate those who have nothing? What shall I say to you? Shall I commend you in this? No, I will not. So what's the problem? Well, the problem is they are abusing the Lord's Supper. Particularly in this case. Now, there are many ways we can abuse the Lord's Supper. We can abuse it by sitting here and not taking it with the right mindset. We'll get to that later on. But in 17 through 22, what's the specific abuse? They're treating it as a meal. They weren't partaking together. Some were coming and taking it ahead of time. Others didn't have anything to take up when they got there. They were treating it as a meal, not as a memorial. Right? And so they were, as it says, some are going hungry and others are getting drunk. Right? Some are having a lot and some are having little. In verse 22, then he says, "What, do you not have houses to eat or drink in, or you despise the church of God and humiliate those who have nothing? If you're going to eat a meal, where should it be eaten? It should be eaten at home." It should not be protecting the Lord's Supper and abusing it. It should not be them coming together for a meal. It should be them eating at home. Now, 23 through 25, then, is the fourth account of the institution of the Lord's Supper. Now, the Gospels, there are four Gospels. Only three record the institution of the Lord's Supper. It's the three synoptic: Matthew, Mark, Luke. John does not record for us. John records more of that night for us in that upper room, but he does not record the institution of the Lord's Supper. So you'll find it in Matthew. It'll be in Matthew 26, I think it's Mark 14, and Luke 22, I think is what it is. 21 or 22, I think is where it's at. But you'll find those accounts in those three. The fourth account is found here in verses 23 through 25 of 1 Corinthians. "For I received from the Lord that also delivered to you, that the Lord Jesus, on the night when he was betrayed, took bread. When he given thanks, he broke it and said, 'This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me.' In the same way also he took the cup after supper, saying, 'This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me.'" And so it's a reminder, right? The breaking of the bread, the unleavened bread, and the partaking of the fruit of the vine, and the reminder that it's a memorial, right? Do this in remembrance of me. That's the purpose of the Lord's Supper. It's to be partaken as a memorial to remind us of his death. So then he comes back in verse 26 and reminds them of the proper taking. Now that he's given them what Christ said, here's how one partakes properly. Verse 26, "For as often as you eat this bread or drink the cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes." Now, as a side note, I think verse 26, along with Acts 27, which says the first day, shows us we need to partake every first day. Acts 20, verse 7, they came together on the first day of the week to break bread. Every week has a first day, so we partake every first day. But verse 26 would show regularly the partaking of it. "For as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup." And that shows a regularity in partaking of it. But what he says is, when you partake of that, you're proclaiming the Lord's death. That's what you're supposed to be doing. Not what they were doing, but that's what they were supposed to be doing. He says, "Whoever therefore eats the bread or drinks the cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner will be guilty concerning the body and blood of the Lord. Let a person examine himself then, and so eat of the bread and drink of the cup. For anyone who eats and drinks without discerning the body eats and drinks judgment on himself. That is why many of you are weak and ill, and some have died. But if we judge ourselves truly, we will not be judged. But when we are judged by the Lord, we are disciplined, so that we may not be condemned along with the world. So then, my brothers, when you come together to eat, wait for one another. If anyone is hungry, let him eat at home, so that when you come together, it will not be for judgment. About the other things, I will give directions when I come." So he reminds them then, you partaking, you're proclaiming the Lord's death. So verse 23, if you partake in an unworthy manner, you're therefore guilty of his body, right? You're guilty of the body and blood of the Lord. You may not have been the one that was swinging the hammer, driving the nails, but you might as well have been. That's why he says the person needs to examine himself. We need to make sure when we're partaking that we are, verse 29, discerning the Lord's body. There's a time in which we've got to make sure, when we're partaking, that our mind is in the right place. That we're partaking looking back to that death. All right, so that may be many ways. We may just sit there and think about it. Somebody may read a passage, look at their Bible, read a passage, read through a song about the Lord's Supper or Christ's crucifixion, a number of things. But those are all done in order to help us get our minds focused in the right area. Because if we don't partake in the right way, we're guilty of the body and the blood of the Lord. We eat and drink condemnation to ourselves. Lord willing, on Sunday morning, we'll pick up in chapter 12 and begin the unit of chapters on spiritual gifts. And again, I'll try to have that outline out Sunday morning if I get the printer to work and get it printed off for you.